The ground doesn't always warn you. Sometimes it just moves. A little, then a lot, then everything at once. On the morning of May 18, 1980, the north face of Mount St. Helens didn't erupt upward like the postcards promised. It exploded sideways. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake ripped through the mountain's core at 8:32 a.m., and in the span of a single breath, the entire northern slope, 2,300 feet of solid rock, ice, and forest, began to slide. Not collapse. Slide. Like a zipper pulled across the skin of the earth, the mountain peeled open from east to west, releasing a superheated hurricane of gas, ash, and stone traveling at 300 miles per hour. Geologist David Johnston, stationed just 6 miles away at Coldwater 2, got out one transmission. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. Then the radio went dead. The blast that followed would flatten 230 square miles of forest, vaporize Spirit Lake, bury entire logging camps under 200 feet of debris, and kill 57 people, some instantly, some over hours, clawing through ash that burned skin on contact. But what makes this story unforgettable isn't just the death toll. It's the false sense of safety that came before. The mountain had been grumbling for 2 months. Tourists flocked to see the show. Entrepreneurs sold souvenir ash in bottles. And Harry Truman, the 84-year-old lodge owner who refused to leave Spirit Lake, became a folk hero for defying the evacuation orders. He told reporters he'd rather die than abandon his mountain. He got his wish. His body was never found, buried under hundreds of feet of mud and stone, along with his lodge, his cats, and the lake he loved. But to understand how it all went so catastrophically wrong, you have to rewind. You have to go back to the weeks before, when the mountain first stirred, when scientists saw the warning signs but couldn't make anyone listen, when families packed their cars for a weekend camping trip with no idea they were driving toward an invisible countdown. You have to go back to the moment when the earth began to crack and no one knew how to stop what was coming. Stay with us, because this is the story of the day the mountains stopped being scenery and became a weapon. March 27th, 1980. Southwestern Washington, 6:02 in the morning. The sun rises over the Cascade Range, painting the snow-capped peaks in soft gold. Mount St. Helens stands 9,877 feet tall, symmetrical, graceful, and the Mount Fuji of America. Campers, hikers, photographers converge on the mountain for the weekend. 5 miles from the summit, near Spirit Lake, Forest Service Supervisor Kathy Anderson and her tree planting crew hear a sound like distant dynamite. They assume it's stump blasting from the logging operations. It isn't. Deep beneath the surface, magma has begun to move. The mountain hasn't erupted in 123 years, but it's waking up. A small explosion of steam and ash opens a 250-foot crater at the summit. Within minutes, word reaches the U.S. Geological Survey in California. Geologist Don Swanson packs his bags and catches the first flight north. The next day, helicopter pilot Jess Hagerman flies over the volcano. He sees cracks running horizontally around the mountain's north face, huge fractures like the earth is unzipping itself. Scientists install monitoring equipment at an observation post called Coldwater 1. The eruption is minor, but they see it as a warning. David Johnston, a 30-year-old volcanologist, tells a news crew, "It's probably heating up very quickly. An eruption may be likely." The Forest Service closes the top of the mountain and evacuates 40 residents. But the warnings backfire. Instead of staying away, tourists pour in from around the country. Vendors hawk T-shirts and bottles of genuine volcanic ash along the highway. Some volcano enthusiasts, like 29-year-old radio technician Robert Rogers, make a game of sneaking past the roadblocks. He brags about sleeping in a blue sleeping bag on the summit ridge while deputies searched for him below. He'd drive up to the checkpoint, act concerned, ask the officers if people really tried to sneak in. They'd tell him about some guy in a blue sleeping bag they'd spotted 2 mornings ago. "Oh, really?" Rogers would say, grinning. "What did you do to try to catch him?" He was the guy in the blue sleeping bag. For geologists, though, this is no game. Over the next 4 weeks, a massive bulge appears on the north side of the mountain. Magma rising from below has hit a blockage in the volcanic conduit and is forcing its way outward, pushing the entire north face of the mountain like a balloon inflating under pressure. The mountain swells by 5 feet per day, day after day after day. The bulge grows larger, more pronounced, more dangerous. Dan Miller, a volcano hazard specialist, tries to convince state and federal agencies that something ugly is about to happen. But as weeks pass without a major event, public excitement dies down. People grow complacent. Officials establish a red zone, a safety perimeter extending 3 to 8 miles from the summit. But not everyone leaves. Harry R. Truman, an 84-year-old lodge owner on Spirit Lake, tells reporters he has no plans to go. "That's my life. Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens is my life. I've lived there 50 years. If the damn thing takes this mountain, I'm going along with it. I'd rather be dead than live without it." Overnight, Truman becomes a folk hero. His defiance of authority makes him a symbol of American stubbornness. Newspapers run stories about the old man who won't budge. Television crews interview him on his porch, his cats wandering around his feet, Spirit Lake shimmering behind him. He jokes, he curses, he drinks whiskey on camera. People love him. But beneath the surface, beneath the jokes and the bravado, the mountain is preparing something no one has ever seen. Scientists monitor the seismic activity closely. The earthquakes are constant now, dozens per day, sometimes hundreds. The bulge continues to grow. On May 1st, the USGS sets up a new observation post, Coldwater 2, just 5 miles from the summit, 3 miles closer than the existing station. It's a risk, but they need better data. A graduate student is supposed to man the post that weekend, but he has to leave. Don Swanson and David Johnston agree to take turns filling in. "I'll do it for Saturday night if you can come up on Sunday and replace me," Johnston says. Swanson agrees. Johnston packs his equipment and drives up to Coldwater 2 alone. May 17th, 1980. 8 hour in the morning. It's been 6 weeks since the first eruption. Many residents are convinced the crisis has passed. They gather at the nearest roadblock, demanding access to their homes. Tempers flare. One man shouts, "We're paying taxes and we'd like to use our property. I'm not afraid." Governor Dixie Lee Ray relents and allows them to visit their property, just for today and tomorrow. Everyone signs waivers releasing the county from blame. The mountain has been quiet for days now. The bulge is still growing, but there have been no explosions, no dramatic plumes of ash. People begin to think the scientists were overreacting. Maybe the worst is over. Maybe the mountain is just settling down. 25 miles west of the summit, high school sweethearts Venus Durgan and Roald Raitan park their car by the Toutle River. They have no idea what's about to happen. They sit by the water, listen to the radio, enjoy the sunshine. Roald has hidden a bottle of champagne in their cooler. A surprise treat for Sunday night. 6 miles west of the summit, ham radio operator Ty Kearney volunteers to monitor the mountain for the state. He receives a transmission from Jerry Martin, another volunteer stationed 7 miles from the bulging north face. Martin has his radio van parked at the perfect viewpoint, a ridge overlooking the entire northern slope. He's backpacking with his wife Lou and their 2 young daughters, 3-month-old Tara and 4-year-old Bonnie. It's a beautiful spot. Peaceful, the kind of place you'd bring your family. 14 miles northeast of the summit, amateur photographer Gary Rosenquist and his friends set up camp in Bear Meadows. They make a big fire, tell stories, enjoy the beautiful night. The sky is clear, the air is warm, and the mountain looms in the distance, silent and majestic. Tree planting crew, Chief Kathy Anderson, decides to relocate her team to Swift Creek, 6 miles south of the summit. She doesn't know why she makes this decision. It's out of the norm, and it doesn't make sense. Logistically, they were supposed to keep working at Clearwater Creek, finish the job there first, but something tells her to move. She can't explain it. Her crew is surprised. One of them, Ronan Kilpatrick, thinks they're actually moving closer to the mountain, potentially into more danger, but Kathy insists. They pack up and relocate. If they had stayed at their original site on the north side, they would all be dead within hours. 30 miles away, Dorothy Stoffel and her husband Keith, both geologists, charter a small plane to fly over the volcano. They've been fascinated by the mountain's activity and want to see it up close. Dorothy has never flown in a small plane before. She's nervous, unsettled, not knowing what to expect. But Keith convinces her this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They take off from Yakima at dawn. The flight is smooth. The sky is clear. As they approach the mountain, Dorothy presses her camera against the window, snapping photos of the crater, the glaciers, the bulge on the north face. At 8:30 a.m., they fly directly over the summit, about 500 feet above the crater. Dorothy takes photos of Harry Truman's Lodge far below, nestled on the shore of Spirit Lake. The lake is calm, mirror-smooth, reflecting the sky. Everything looks peaceful. Below the summit, Lou Moore makes breakfast at her family's campsite near the Green River, 13 miles north of the volcano. Tara sits beside her in the morning sun. Bonnie wanders nearby, exploring the trees. Mike Moore is relaxing by the tent, thinking about the hike they'll take today. It's a perfect morning. Quiet, warm, safe. At Coldwater 2, David Johnston radios in his morning report. Everything is normal. The seismic monitors show the usual background tremors. The bulge is still there, still growing, but nothing has changed. He brews coffee, checks his equipment, waits. Geologist Don Swanson is at the USGS office in Vancouver, waiting for colleagues to arrive. They're supposed to bring him supplies so he can drive up to Coldwater 2 and relieve Johnson for the rest of the weekend. He's in no hurry. There's no reason to rush. The mountain has been quiet for days. Dan Miller is also heading up to Coldwater 2. He's bringing supplies and parts for the 2 time-lapse cameras they've installed near the crater. He picks up a load of batteries from the charging shed and loads them into his truck. It's a 2-hour drive to the observation post. He figures he'll be there by mid-morning. Nearly 8 miles west of the summit, Robert Rogers and Francisco Valenzuela arrive at the Sheep Creek overlook. They've just finished another illegal climb to the summit. They're tired, exhilarated, covered in ash and sweat. They park near Ty Kearney's van. Kearney looks up and says, "Where were you boys this morning?" Rogers and Valenzuela make up some story about driving around. They don't want to admit they'd snuck into the red zone again. 8:30 in the morning. Just above the summit, Dorothy Stoffel is taking photos of the volcano from the small plane. They're flying directly over the south crater wall, about 500 feet above the rim. As they pass over the mountain, Dorothy snaps pictures of Harry Truman's lodge one more time. The pilot circles back for another pass. Keith says, "We'll make one last pass and then head back." And then, 1 mile beneath Mount St. Helens, the earth cracks. An earthquake measuring 5.1 on the Richter scale rips through the mountain's core. Dorothy Stoffel, in the plane above, sees a massive fracture open across the summit. It happens so fast she barely has time to process it. "We began to see this enormous fracture open up," she'll say later. "It was as though you were slicing the mountain in half. The entire north side of the mountain begins to shake, and then, like a zipper, unzipping from east to west, small brown detonations pop across the peak. Poof, 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 poof. I just looked up, heard some sound, and it was this tremendous signal," Gary Rosenquist will say. "The ground moved a little bit, and then, oh my God, the whole mountain took off." The north face of Mount St. Helens doesn't collapse. It slides. The entire northern slope, 300 feet of solid rock, ice, and forest, roughly 3 cubic kilometers of material, begins to move as one gigantic block. It's the largest landslide in recorded history, and it's happening at 150 miles per hour. But before the landslide can even settle, something far worse is unleashed. The collapsing flank has unroofed a body of superheated magma inside the volcano. For weeks, this magma has been rising, pushing against the mountain's interior, building pressure. Around it is a jacket of superheated groundwater, heated to hundreds of degrees but kept in liquid form by the immense pressure of the overlying rock. When the north face slides away, that pressure is suddenly released. The water flashes instantly to steam. The result is catastrophic, a lateral blast of gas, steam, and pulverized rock fragments moving at 300 to 670 miles per hour, traveling not upward like a normal volcanic eruption, but horizontally, straight out from the mountain's north face. Dorothy Stoffel's pilot sees it coming. He realizes instantly that they're in mortal danger. He puts the plane into a nosedive to gain speed. They're doing 200 miles per hour, trying to outrun the cloud. Dorothy watches the ground coming up from below, thinking he's going to nose the plane right into the earth, but he pulls up at the last second, banks hard to the south, and accelerates. Behind them, the mountain explodes with a force 500 times greater than the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. Lightning bolts crackle through the ash column, shooting tens of thousands of feet into the sky. The entire sky behind them turns black. They barely escape. At Coldwater 2, David Johnston sees the blast coming. He has just seconds to react. He grabs his radio, keys the microphone, and transmits one final message. "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." Then the shockwave hits. The observation post, a small trailer with monitoring equipment, is obliterated instantly. Johnston's body is never found. The blast sweeps over the ridge where he was stationed and continues racing down the valley, incinerating everything in its path. At Coldwater 1, 8 miles from the summit, photographer Roe Finley and Reed Blackburn are at the observation post when they hear the explosion. Blackburn, on assignment with the Vancouver Columbian newspaper, has 2 remote control cameras positioned 1 mile from the summit. He's been ready for this moment. He grabs his equipment, jumps into his car, and floors it, desperately trying to outrun the cloud. But it's too late. Within seconds, his car is engulfed. He suffocates in 4 feet of scalding ash, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. His body will be found 3 days later, burned and buried. The wind is so powerful that it uproots 100-foot trees as far as 19 miles away. The trees don't just fall over, they're snapped off at the base, torn from the ground, flung through the air like toothpicks. Some are stripped of their bark and branches before they even hit the ground. The blast moves like a living thing, rolling over ridges, funneling through valleys, crushing and burning everything in its path. 8 miles from the summit, Francisco Valenzuela and Robert Rogers jump into their vehicles and screech away. "Our clothing was like in a gale just blowing," Rogers will say. "It was like a freight train with 10,000 square wheels just going by. It was the loudest noise I'd ever heard." They race down the mountain road, barely able to see through the thickening ash. Behind them, the cloud is gaining. 6 miles south of the summit, near Swift Creek, Ronan Kilpatrick's Forest Service crew is running for their lives. Kilpatrick and Kathy Anderson are waiting in their truck at the top of the ridge, ready to lead the evacuation. They can see periodic blasts shooting down the south slope, coming straight at them. "If we had been a half a mile closer, we would have been tortured," Kilpatrick will say. The crew, laden with tools, is slow to climb the steep slope to their vehicles. Kathy calls on her radio. "Dump all the equipment. Let's get out of here." Minutes later, everyone reaches their trucks and drives to a rendezvous site, where they wait for word on a safe evacuation route from a spotter plane. "You could just see the debris going overhead, and we had lightning around us," Kilpatrick remembers. Finally, word comes over the radio that the ash is still too thick to allow a spotter plane to fly into their area. They'll have to find their own way out. They drive across the bridge over Swift Creek. Kilpatrick runs out onto the bridge to check if a mud flow is coming down. There isn't one. Not yet. He signals everyone across. Just on the other side of the bridge, his truck stalls. The truck in front of him disappears into the cloud. We didn't see anybody. It was like, oh my God, we're alone here. Kilpatrick radios Anderson, and she hurries back to pick him up. The convoy slowly makes its way down the mountain to safety. 13 miles north of the summit, Mike and Lou Moore and their daughters, 3-month-old Tara and 4-year-old Bonnie, look up to see a tremendous cloud towering over the trees. Mike grabs his camera and starts shooting. The more pictures I took, the more apprehensive I got, because the blast was not going up. It was coming toward us like it was being shot out of a shotgun. The ash, hot enough to burn skin on contact, surges down the mountain at 300 miles per hour. Then they feel it, a squeezing of their bodies, a pressure in their ears. Mike's ears pop repeatedly. Lou doesn't feel it the same way, but she sees Mike's reaction. The shockwave has reached them. 40 miles away in Vancouver, National Geographic editor Roe Finley is in his hotel room when the phone rings. It's Ralph Perry, one of their contract photographers. Roe, if you'll step out the door of your motel and look northeast, you can see Mount St. Helens filling the sky. Finley steps outside. The entire northeastern horizon is black. A massive column of ash is rising into the stratosphere, spreading outward like a mushroom cloud. At his home in Kelso, Ray Pleasant, a helicopter-based manager for the Weyerhaeuser Corporation, is still in bed when his neighbor knocks on the door. She monitors the police scanner and heard that the mountain has erupted. Pleasant immediately heads to the nearest helicopter base. Although his logging crews are outside the red zone, he needs every available chopper in the air for possible rescues. At the Air National Guard base at Fort Lewis, Jess Hagerman is getting ready for church when his phone rings. How many people do we have that can fly? He heads to the base 20 miles away. This is a rescue operation now. The vertical column of ash and steam continues to expand upward and outward. It will eventually reach 15 miles into the sky, punching through the stratosphere. 13 miles away at the Green River campsite, ash begins to rain onto the Moore family. They take cover in a dilapidated hunter's shack, but it offers little protection. The ash is everywhere, in their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. Mike and Lou's only thought, keep their daughters alive. They give Bonnie a handkerchief wetted with water from a canteen. For Tara, they wrap her in blankets. But Tara is so quiet that at one point, Lou pinches her to make sure she's still breathing. The baby cries. They're all relieved. The intense heat from the volcano melts the mountain's ice cap, sending 46 billion gallons of water into the Toutle Valley below. Mud flows, lahars, heated to 91 degrees Fahrenheit and moving at 90 miles per hour, rush down the mountain. 25 miles from the summit, along the south fork of the Toutle River, high school sweethearts Roald Raytan and Venus Durgan hear the sound of warning sirens. We just pulled the tent right out of the stakes and ran up to the car, Venus remembers. Roald guns the engine of his Oldsmobile, but it's too late. The engorged Toutle River is now a raging torrent, carrying logs and debris from nearby lumber yards. The mud flow surrounds their car and lifts it off the ground. At that point, the first instinct was to get out of the car, but there was no place to run. They jump out. Venus lands between two massive logs and is sucked underwater. Roald sees her hand reaching out between the logs as they close in around her. The logs are moving up and down and sideways, peeling the skin off her chin. I felt him grab me, pull me up on top of a log, and he just kept screaming to hang on. After a terrifying mile-long ride, Roald maneuvers Venus across the logs and onto the bank of the river. Venus's wrist is smashed, her right forearm stripped down to the muscle. She's going into shock. But Roald knows their only chance of survival is to keep moving. They make their way through the thick forest, hoping to find a way out. Walking back through that was hell, Venus says. I heard a number of helicopters overhead, so at that point I wanted to get out of that heavy stand of trees and be found. 9 miles from the summit, tree planters Ronan Kilpatrick and Kathy Anderson have been waiting for 30 minutes with a convoy of Forest Service trucks. They're hoping a spotter plane will arrive soon to scout a safe route off the mountain. They're in constant danger of being engulfed by burning ash. One crew member starts to panic and tries to run. They grab him and throw him back into the van, literally knock some sense into him. The ash is so thick they can barely see 10 feet ahead. Lightning crackles around them. Finally, word comes over the radio that they'll have to find their own way out. Kathy runs onto the bridge over Swift Creek to check if a mud flow is coming. There isn't one. Not yet. She signals everyone across. Just on the other side, Kilpatrick's truck stalls. He radios Anderson and she comes back for him. The convoy slowly makes its way down the mountain. They make it to safety. 2 miles from the summit, geologist Don Swanson is flying in a Forest Service plane, searching for his colleague David Johnston. He knows there's not much chance that Dave or anybody else in the area survived. Heading toward the mountain in a Cessna, Roe Finley hopes to reach photographer Reed Blackburn at Coldwater 1. I'd flown over cities bombed and burning during the war, he'll say later, but this was so much more awesome. The wind shifts and the ash cloud heads east, a welcome sight to the Moore family, who have been hiding in an old shack for hours. Mike decides it's time to go outside. The door is blocked with 6 inches of ash. It takes quite a bit of kicking to get it open. Outside, he can make out the outline of a tree. That's when I started feeling pretty good, he says. Lou Moore carries 3-month-old Tara, while Mike Moore gathers up 4-year-old Bonnie. He shoulders the backpack containing their tent, food, and survival equipment. On a logging road 8 miles from the summit, Robert Rogers and Francisco Valenzuela are lost in the haze of ash. They've been driving in circles, passing the same giant Caterpillar tractor twice in the dark. Then way behind them, they see a little pinpoint of light. As the air slowly clears, Rogers and Valenzuela are able to navigate their way out. The ash cloud reaches Yakima, 97 miles to the northeast. Though no longer hot, the ash makes it difficult to breathe. Residents must shovel it off their roofs to keep them from collapsing. A weather satellite captures photos of the ash cloud stretching across Washington state, reaching Spokane, 200 miles northeast. It will eventually circle the globe. It's been nearly 3 hours since Venus and Rold escaped the mud flow. They struggle through dense forest, following the river upstream. I knew we had to go upstream because we floated underneath the bridge, Rold says. I figured if anybody was going to be anywhere, they'd be there. Finally, they see a sheriff's car on a bridge. The deputy radios for a helicopter evacuation. Nearly 4 hours after the first explosion, the eruption is still going strong. Fresh magma is rising up, escaping from the volcano in jets of burning gas that sweep down the flanks of Mount St. Helens at up to 80 miles per hour. 11 miles from the summit, Mike Moore and his wife Lou try to get their young daughters to safety. Weighed down with survival equipment, Mike comes to an area of blown-down trees 6 to 12 feet in diameter. I couldn't carry Bonnie. Lou couldn't carry her because she had Tara in her backpack. Bonnie was basically on her own, in between us. She's a pretty tough kid, but for 4 years old, you're asking an awful lot. 14 miles from the summit, Gary Rosenquist's group watches the ash cloud roll toward them. As it rolled over each ridge, the horror in us got greater and greater as we comprehended that it was coming closer. We saw these ridge lines that seemed so very solid in the human mind just be overtaken so easily. We saw the ridge line that was in front of us, and I'm sure all of us thought it was going to go over that one, which it, of course, did not. As it hit the ridge line in front of us, it went completely to the side. At that point, the blast went around us, totally encompassed our camp area. Not everyone is so lucky. 200 square miles of forest are blown down or scorched by the blast. The blast speed ranges from 220 to 670 miles per hour. After traveling about 15 miles from the volcano, the stone wind loses much of its force. It can no longer blow the trees down, but it remains hot enough to scorch them. This creates a stark, narrow band of standing dead trees along the edge of untouched forest. Despite the violence of the initial eruption, people in the river valleys below Mount St. Helens are still largely unaware of the full scope of what has happened. On the south fork of the Toutle River, residents had no idea that a giant mud flow was headed straight for them. The debris avalanche that came from the volcano contained a lot of water. Wet sediments, fragments of glaciers incorporated in the debris. After the debris avalanche was in place, it began to dewater. Water just started seeping out of it. Water from the melted glaciers combined with everything from boulders to sand-sized sediments to create mud flows, lahars. The consistency of wet cement. They swept down the Toutle River to the north and Muddy River and Pine Creek to the south. Downstream, residents like Jeannie Gaze suspected nothing. When the mountain blew, the sound went north and south, and we didn't even hear it down here. In fact, I was standing out on the deck at 8:30 when it blew, and I didn't even know it. Then when I went back in the house, all of a sudden I noticed it was getting dark. I said, boy, the mountain must have blown again. So we turned on the radio, and they said it really was bad. The first mud flow came down the north fork of the Toutle River at midday, and the Gaze's home was untouched. After the first flow at 12 that came through, then we had left the area. Then at 5:30 we thought, well, we'll go back and see what's happening at the river. Jeannie watched from the far bank while her husband crossed the river and went back to their house. He wanted to go over and get the cat, you know. He just didn't think it was going to be that bad because when it came through before, it was under the deck. It didn't touch the house, so he thought we were going to be okay. We didn't realize what was going on up in the gorge. At Hollywood Gorge, the mud flow had backed up behind a dam of debris. As it flowed, it just kept jamming up, clear back to the start of the gorge. So that's a lot of mess. Weyerhaeuser's Camp Baker had been wiped out earlier, and the logs stored there were now being carried downstream. Logs and debris tore down the valley. 12 bridges and 221 homes were destroyed. The mud flow extended beyond the mouth of the Toutle Valley into the Cowlitz River, beyond the mouth of the Cowlitz River into the Columbia River, and actually deposited enough debris in the channel that it stopped shipping until the channels could be dredged sometime after the eruption. Back at the mountain, the other half of the landslide had flowed to the northeast and crashed into Spirit Lake, creating a tidal wave. The displaced water scoured the surrounding hillsides and washed the blown-down trees back into the lake. These logs created a mat which covered most of the water's surface. Harry Truman's lodge was buried under hundreds of feet of debris. His body was never found. Pyroclastic flows, superheated pumice and gas, reaching temperatures of 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, sterilized the mountain's northern flanks. Here, no life was spared. The mountain continued to erupt over the next 9 hours, blowing ash 16 miles up into the air. Prevailing winds carried it northeast, producing a trail of ash that ranged from more than 3 feet deep near the volcano to visible traces settling in the Midwest. Yakima was the first large town to go dark. Then, as the clouds spread to the northeast, driving in central and eastern Washington became impossible. The population of Ritzville, Washington, doubled from 2,000 to 4,000 as stranded travelers made their way to this oasis in the gray desert. On the eastern edge of Washington, Spokane residents could only watch as a beautiful spring day turned dark as midnight. An eerie silence fell as the blanket of ash caused the city to grind to a halt. In a matter of seconds, the entire region had changed. Before the explosion, the summit of Mount St. Helens was just over 9,600 feet. Now it's 8,300 feet tall. 1,300 feet of mountain was gone, and rescue efforts seemed impossible. Jess Hagerman had been in Washington's Air National Guard since 1976. He was called to duty the day of the eruption. By the time guardsmen had gathered in the town of Longview, 35 miles from the mountain, reports were already coming in that no one could have survived in the blast zone. Unwilling to believe this, Hagerman got permission from his commanding officer to begin searching the area with 5 helicopters. We flew up the South Fork of the Toutle, and, of course, as we all know now, the South Fork of the Toutle really wasn't damaged that badly. And then we swung on up and went on over into the North Fork of the Toutle and past Camp Baker, or where old Camp Baker used to be. This is when they got a report of 2 vehicles driving down the North Fork of the Toutle River. It's also when they started running into ash. I kind of liken it sometimes to flying around in a milk bottle. The sky, the ground, everything was pretty much the same color, flying around in the ash. We can sort of sense by this time that there probably aren't 2 vehicles on a road because the roads are all clobbered with trees and there's ash everywhere. But then through the dismal landscape, Hagerman and his crew chief spotted a truck. We swung around to have a closer look, dropped down a little bit, and what we did see were footprints leading from this rig down the road. Of course, then you're excited because you found some live people who have obviously been up here since the eruption because their footprints were making tracks in this ash. And then all of a sudden we came around the corner there, and we found 2 people laying on the road. Initially, they thought they couldn't land in the ash because they couldn't see the ground when they got close. You never want to do that flying helicopters. But at great risk to himself and his machine, Hagerman did land. And when he did, he was shocked by what he saw. These folks were probably 15 miles from the mountain. They were on the backside of 2 ridge lines, couldn't see the mountain at all from where they were, where they had been working. And their faces were completely burned. I think Jim Symanky, which was one of the guys who finally did survive out of that group of 4. Anyway, he had severe burns all over his face, had open sores on his face, his hands were black. First look, you'd think that he had black working gloves on, but they weren't. They were just his hands had been burned that badly. As the rescue continued, others were pulled from the bleak landscape. Some were alive, but many were dead. People like Harry Truman and United States Geological Survey geologist David Johnston, who were right in the mountain's shadow, probably had little time to react and were never found. But for others, Hagerman witnessed a different story. They obviously had seen the eruption. They had jumped in their truck and started off. They were heading away from the blast when it hit them, and it was probably pretty much an instantaneous death, I think. The driver still had his hands on the wheel. His head was still up. They were just sitting there dead. And the passenger was sitting in the passenger seat just with his hands in his lap. With this whole rescue effort, you look around and you say, who else can do this? It's got to be done. So you sort of buck up and you do what you have to do. Hagerman says it's the possibility of finding someone alive that keeps you going. Identifying and trying to verify license numbers and those kinds of things, that's not a fun part of a search and rescue mission. Anytime you can find live people, it's fun and exciting. And there's a lot of variation in your enthusiasm for doing that kind of a job. Rescue crews like Hagerman saved almost 200 people following the eruption, but in all, 57 lost their lives. Millions of birds, fish, and small game, along with thousands of deer, elk, mountain goat, and bear, were also killed. The cloud of ash distributed 540 million tons of ash over an area of more than 22,000 square miles, and eventually circled the globe. It was miserable to deal with and damaged all equipment that had to operate in it. But in eastern Washington, the effects from the eruption were relatively short-lived. However, ash was only one of the problems for people right around the mountain. Cleaning up after the eruption would take years, and for many, life would never be the same. Ray Pleasant's helicopter arrives to evacuate Venus and Rolled. The crew jumps out and loads Venus in. I was able to look back, Pleasant says. I just saw this brown body, tiny little brown body in the back, with big, big eyes looking at me, just scared. A second helicopter airlifts Rolled out. The choppers fly across the river to the town of Toutley, where a medevac unit has been set up at a school. At Longview Hospital, Venus receives medical attention. Her wounds are filled with ash. The nurses were crying because they had to immerse me in a tub of water and take sponges and scrape out my wounds. And when the doctor came in, he said, "You didn't do a good enough job." They had to take me back in a second time, and they had to put me on morphine at that point because I was in such pain. Robert Rogers makes it out of the woods and stops on the I-5 freeway to look back at the volcano 25 miles away. Everybody was stopped on the freeway looking at the volcano, saying, "Look at him, he's covered with ash." And I drove back to Portland, and that was that. Now that the pressure within the volcano is relieved, the eruption gradually begins to subside. 200 square miles of forest have been destroyed. Heavy equipment lays tossed about like toys. 9.5 hours after the eruption, Venus Durgan's boyfriend, Rolled Rayton, is released from Longview Hospital into his parents' care. They find a hotel for the night, and Rolled's father tries to scrub more ash from his son's wounds. "Oh, it hurts so bad. I passed out. I mean, God bless him. He did a pretty good job, but he didn't get it all out. So I'm tattooed in spots on my legs from where the ash got rubbed into my skin." In her hospital room, Venus Durgan watches coverage of the eruption. I laid in the hospital room that night watching all the events on TV. My IV bottle in the hospital was shaking every time the mountain rushed, but not everyone is out of danger. As night falls on Mount St. Helens, Mike Moore, his wife, and 2 young daughters have not been able to find their way out of the forest. They pitch camp for the night, but Mike cannot sleep. We could hear the volcano exploding and crackling, kind of like a witch's cauldron. They will have to wait for sunrise and hope for rescue. On the morning of May 19, 1980, on the morning after the eruption of Mount St. Helens, National Guard helicopter pilot Jess Hagerman takes to the sky to continue the rescue effort. I really didn't have a clue where I was. You couldn't see more than 1/8 of a mile, sometimes less. When the ash does part, it reveals fallen trees stretching as far as the eye can see. Despite the devastation, rescuers still hope to find survivors. But as time goes by, they find themselves placing more and more red flags to mark the dead. One family on the mountain has survived the eruption. Mike Moore, his wife Lou, and their 2 children have spent 26 hours in the forest near Mount St. Helens, unable to make their way to safety. Suddenly, here comes the helicopter flying their direction. It's the 304 Squadron out of Portland. They put 2 paramedics on the ground. The Air Force team tries to airlift the family out, but every time the cable comes down, the helicopter kicks up so much ash nobody can see the cable. A cable rescue is impossible. The chopper will have to find a place to touch down. The Moore family and the paramedics hike to the Green River, but find no room for a landing there either. At that moment, Air National Guard chopper pilot Jess Hagerman flies over. He radios the rescue team and offers to use his smaller craft to evacuate the Moores. There was no place to set the helicopter all the way down, so I had to kind of hold it on one skid. The Moores, who have their 3-month-old daughter Tara in their backpack, climb into the helicopter. They start sticking this great big, huge Kelty backpack in. I said, "We don't have room for that." They said, "Well, there's a baby in there." I said, "Well, stuff her aboard." Hagerman takes off and brings the Moore family to nearby Longview Hospital, where they are treated for minor scratches and sent home. Hundreds of volunteers rescue more than 150 people in just 36 hours, but 3 are still missing and 8 are confirmed dead. 31 hours after the eruption, Venus Durgan is released from the hospital. She faces 2 years of physical therapy to regain the use of her flayed arm. 2 days after the eruption, a group of geologists lands near the observation base Coldwater 1. There they find photographer Reed Blackburn's car. We kneel down to look inside the car, and there was Reed. His hair was burned and so forth. Looking in the car, it was pretty gruesome. 3 days after the eruption, President Jimmy Carter flies over the area, surveying the destruction. Federal emergency relief is on its way for the 4 counties hardest hit by the blast. The absolute and total devastation of a region that encompasses about 150 square miles. It's the worst thing I've ever seen. The force of the eruption has spewed measurable amounts of ash as far east as Minnesota and as far south as Oklahoma. May 25, 1980. 1 week after the big blast, the mountain erupts again, sending a column of ash 8 miles high. Compared to the May 18th eruption, it's a minor event and does minimal damage. The death toll now stands at 21 and 72 people are missing. 230 square miles have been devastated. Roadways have been swept away and railroads buried. 68,000 acres of commercial timber, worth $400 million, have been damaged or destroyed. Forester Jim Symanky is at Emmanuel Hospital Burn Center in Portland, Oregon, where he endures 4 skin graft operations for the burns that covered nearly half his body. He is the only survivor of his 4-man crew. Along the devastated Toutle River, Rold's brother locates the buried car and retrieves Rold's things from the trunk. So he brings in all this stuff, and then he pulls out and shows Rold's parents, "Hey, look what I found in the back of Rold's car." Big bottle of champagne. We're both underage, and Rold's parents just look at Rold. And we just kind of sat there and slithered in my seat. We laughed. The champagne, it was the best I ever tasted in my life. It was like double sweet, because we lived through that, and that bottle lived through it. No more survivors are found, and bodies are recovered for months after the blast. There is no trace of 30-year-old geologist David Johnston, who was last heard from at the Coldwater 2 observation site. The body of the last member of Jim Simanki's forestry crew is finally found in the branches of a tree about 2 feet above a high water mark made by the Toutle River, dead from ash inhalation. In the end, the death toll will reach 57. Less than a year after the eruption, the first tree is planted in the blast zone. 5 million more are planted over the next 3 years. The Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument is established, and tourism increases dramatically, boosting the area's economy. Thousands flock to the mountain. A new Spirit Lake highway is built to carry visitors to the spot where Coldwater 2 once stood. 20 years after the disaster, the National Forest Service organizes a reunion for rescuers and survivors. For those who attend, it's a time to remember and reflect. "I was one of the lucky ones," Kathy Anderson says. "And through that luck of not going back to where we were on Saturday, I'm here today. I don't take life for granted, nor do I take our children for granted. It's not lost on me what a gift it is to have them." Venus Durgan and Rold Riton have remained friends. The eruption forged a bond that has stood the test of time. The ultimate act of love and friendship that anybody can do is risk their life to save yours, Venus says. And I don't think you're going to ask for anyone to do anything more for you. And for that, I'll always be grateful to Rold. There'll always be a place in my heart. The May 18th, 1980, eruption of Mount St. Helens remains the most devastating volcanic event in the history of the continental United States. Some of its impact has been positive. The U.S. Geological Survey used the data from the eruption to create technological advances, including a satellite warning system for possible eruptions. Their work has saved thousands of lives and honors the 57 men, women, and children who lost their lives at Mount St. Helens. "When you see an erupting volcano," Dorothy Stoffel says, "the power and the impact, the energy that's being released is truly stunning, and it makes you realize that we are pretty insignificant creatures next to an erupting volcano." But the story doesn't end there. In the years that follow, the mountain begins to heal itself. And so do the people. Scientists return to the blast zone, expecting to find nothing but lifeless gray ash. Instead, they discover that life has already begun to return. Pocket gophers, which were underground at the time of the eruption, emerge from their tunnels. They feed on the roots of plants that survive beneath the ash. Seeds blow in on the wind and take root in erosion gullies. Fireweed, one of the most tenacious plants, begins to grow. Elk and deer return to graze on the new vegetation. Coyotes follow, hunting small mammals. Even signs of cougar appear in the high country. In the rivers, fish that survived in side streams begin to repopulate the main channels. The Toutle River, which was literally steaming in place the day after the eruption, gradually cools and clears. Castle and Coldwater lakes are created by the landslide, blocking off side channels. Within a few years, the lakes clear themselves. By 1993, a fish is found in Spirit Lake. A little rainbow trout nicknamed Harry after the cantankerous lodge owner who refused to leave. "It's a little rainbow that we did some genetic workup on," a biologist says. "People think they've been planted up there, but it's a wild fish as far as we can determine. The fish is 18 inches long and weighs 2¼ pounds. It's obvious she's been eating well. But how she got there is still undetermined." Definitely, it is a surprise that anything could come back so soon after the eruption here in the lake, the biologist says. But there are a few tributaries that I think might have held a fish in them, especially if they had some ice over them, which would have made the chances for their survival a lot better. Even after 15 years, it's still hard for Jeannie Gaze to come back to the area. She and her husband Buck lost their home along the North Fork of the Toutle during the mud flows. I said, "Hey, is there a beer up there?" And I would be reaching this high to get a beer off the deck, and that's where it would be. The top of the deck was right there, so that would be roughly 7 feet, I would figure, that we're standing on this mud right now, mud flow. The Gazes were never able to rebuild. Because this part of the disaster was classified as a flood, the Gazes' homeowners insurance wouldn't cover their loss. The government awarded them $30,000 in flood insurance, but that was less than a third of the home's value. Nothing but debris remained, but the money had to go to the bank to pay off their mortgage, a fact that haunted Buck until his death. He just never could accept it, Jeannie says. Everything he had was in the home. We were not able to save money with raising 6 children, and then to lose everything you own. So he always said, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God who's in charge of volcanoes. So I guess he knows now, and we don't. The area is slowly coming back, but Jeannie says many of the people who lived here have not. I mean, you can see there's been no action on their roads, their cabins. Why is that? Fear that the mountain will do it again? It's just an inner feeling. It's a devastation. The beauty's gone. I guess that's it. The beauty's gone, and the river has been a mess, and it's been changing back and forth. But like I say, now it's clearing and things are growing. So the younger generation will come back and use it. Destruction of the area's natural beauty and stricter regulations kept some families from ever coming back. But private landowners were not the only ones who suffered. Companies did as well. The largest was Weyerhaeuser. 10 years after the blast, its recovery efforts were still ongoing. After the 1980 eruption, there were 150,000 acres within the blast zone where trees were strewn about like toothpicks. 68,000 acres of this land belonged to Weyerhaeuser. Of that, 3,600 acres was merchantable timber, timber that was old enough to be salvaged. The rest of it was young stands. Our first efforts were simply to be able to get to the area. All the roads, many of the bridges were all washed out. We ended up opening up, reconstructing, over 600 miles worth of roads. It was the fall of 1980 when Weyerhaeuser moved equipment into the blast zone and began salvaging the merchantable timber. About 1,000 men worked under dangerous and aggravating conditions. Trees were tangled or uprooted, and the ash constantly dulled the chains on their saws. Salvage efforts took 2 years total. We finished in 1982 and pulled out enough timber to build 85,000 three-bedroom homes, 850 million board feet. At days during peak harvest periods, there were as many as 600 truckloads of logs a day coming down the North Toutle Valley from that blast zone area. It looked like business was booming, but Weyerhaeuser spokesmen say that is not the case. The company's total loss due to the eruption is reported to have been $66 million. Nevertheless, Weyerhaeuser immediately began looking to the future. Between 1981 and 1987, the company planted more than 18 million trees in the blast zone. This stand was one of the original areas that we came back into, far away from the mountain as we could get. We put about $1 million into some research, some plantings in the blast zone, to try and see what would work and what wouldn't work, what kind of problems we might run into. And we discovered that anything more than maybe 6 inches of ash, we were going to have to do something special. You just couldn't plant the seedlings in the ash. It was too sterile. It did not have the nutrients that trees needed to grow. Where we salvage logged, it stirred the area up well enough that was excellent for planting. In other areas, the ash had to be scraped away to expose the mineral-rich parent soil before each seedling was planted by hand. Right after the 1980 eruption, the blast zone looked lifeless. 15 years later, some of the seedlings planted by Weyerhaeuser were over 40 feet tall. Now they are 70 feet tall and a foot in diameter. The regeneration is going so well that Weyerhaeuser has begun thinning the stands of trees it planted right after the 1980 eruption. Our design was to do our normal planting of 435 trees per acre, knowing that by age 25 that's too many. One of the things that's changed is technology, because we had originally thought of thinning up here at about age 30. But the technology has improved so much that we now have equipment that can go into these younger ages that we're at now, with 25 years in these crowded conditions that we have, and thin out some of the weaker and dying trees, and some of the trees that have natural defects that don't make lumber. Because everything we have here is grown for lumber. We are planning right now to enter these stands and start thinning projects, probably 1,000 acres a year on the average for the next 10 years. For those who have been here throughout the entire process, the transformation is unforgettable. I really wasn't anxious to come up here and look around and see everything destroyed. Plus, I had a small contract crew that was killed up here, and that, in addition to seeing all the dead trees, was something that just didn't make me anxious to go look at it. But eventually, a month or so after the blast, I had to start the planning process for the regeneration, so I did come up. I can remember my first trip as though it was yesterday. It was nothing but blown down trees covered with ash. All the same color, no sounds, lifeless. And to me, to look at it then and say, hey, we're going to plant this, it was a challenge that I had never faced before. Now, the health and size of the new forest makes it difficult for visitors to tell where the blast zone begins. There is a clearly visible line between where Weyerhaeuser planted seedlings and the boundary of what is now a national monument. However, by the time visitors get to this point, they have already passed through 11 miles of the original blast zone. When they drive into this, they say, when am I going to get to the blast zone? That's their first reaction. They do not believe they're here. They think when they get to the monument where you've now had slow natural regeneration, that's when they enter the blast zone. That slower natural regeneration, which is occurring within the monument's boundaries, is providing scientists with a unique and valuable chance to observe the course nature takes right from the beginning. Back in 1994, monument scientist Peter Frenzen shared what they had learned so far. It was really a wonderful opportunity because we had a chance to look at a large-scale disturbance, something on the order of 100 or more square mile area affected by the eruption, and look at a process that has influenced the forests of the Cascades for many, many thousands of years, and watch kind of the rebirth of an ecosystem, one step at a time, firsthand. The initial expectation was that everything had been destroyed, but closer examination proved different. It has also shown that nature doesn't always act the way we think it will. We're standing here at Meadow Lake, which is about 8 miles north of the volcano, and the amazing thing about the Meadow Lake Basin is that it kind of shows how the blast was channeled by the mountaintops, by the topography, that it came over on its way from the volcano to here. But also, it provides an excellent place to see how life survived, even in the midst of the tremendous blast of fragmented rock and ash that swept over here. Probably the cloud was traveling at a few hundred miles an hour when it came over this point, and it came into the basin, and it swirled around us. And you can see across the lake how the trees are laying every which way and how the blast must have just kind of circled around in this basin. And if you look behind us, on the ridge behind us, you see the tops of the trees that are sticking up above the ridge top, how the blast that skipped over the ridge top snapped them off, sheer, clean breaks across them. You can imagine the force that took. And yet, even with that much force and that much fragmented rock sweeping through here and shattering the forest, you can look around us and see the evidence of surviving plant and animal life all through the area. May 18th in this landscape is still late winter, very early spring. So at that time, there was a lot of snow in the area, a lot of ice. The lake was ice-covered, and the evidence of the snow cover and its importance to survival can be seen in this specific silver fir tree right here. This silver fir was probably on the order of this tall at the time of the eruption. And so when the eruption came along and blasted off the overstory, the larger trees, these smaller trees, were protected under the snowpack. After the snow melted, the more flexible ones were able to pop up free out of the ash. And these trees are beginning to produce cones now, and they'll provide a very important source of seed in the blast zone. Other seeds, like that of the tenacious fireweed, blew in on the wind and took root in erosion gullies, teaching scientists yet another lesson. Normally, people think of erosion as a negative process. They think of erosion as something, oh no, we have to stop erosion, seed it, stabilize it. But here we were dealing with a deposit that was on the order of a few inches to a foot thick. So we're looking at a relatively thin cap on the surviving material. So it was just a matter of erosion coming along, washing that off, and the surviving plants sprouting through. So erosion was really the foundation of the recovery. So what normally would be a negative thing was a very positive one. Another positive discovery was that some animals had also survived the eruption. The same thing that was true for roots, plant roots that survived below the ground, was true for animals. The animals that were underground at the time of the eruption were able to survive. Things like the pocket gopher, which lives its life completely underground, came up through the ash deposit. They were able to feed on the roots of the surviving plants. The gophers were joined by a wide array of other creatures which had their heads down during the eruption. It didn't take long for mobile animals like birds and elk to be seen in the blast zone either. Initially, they only passed through, but now they stay year-round. As the forest has come back and as shrubby vegetation, shrubs and small trees begin to come in, the habitat is changing, so there's more of a place for animals to nest and feed. And so you can kind of see a real picking up in the pace of regeneration. As animals spend more time in the area, they drop the seeds of their favorite food in their droppings. So in effect, they're planting more and more of their foods. So the whole pace of the regeneration in the animal habitat is increasing over time. Grazing animals are also spending more time inside the National Volcanic Monument due to the success of the planting operations around it. Each year, as the trees get bigger and the forest denser, the food supply there decreases. That big open blast zone is quite a boon in terms of available forage. So we see lots of elk and deer in the monument. We also see things like coyotes and even signs of cougar. We've even found some interesting sightings of things even like mountain goats back in the high country. So as the food base has returned and as the habitat has returned, the animals are returning in great numbers. The waterways around St. Helens tell another story of amazing recovery. During the 1980 eruption, entire watersheds were physically altered and became hostile to traditional marine life. We took a temperature out of the Cowlitz River down near the mouth, and it was 95 degrees a day after the eruption. The Tootle was literally just steaming in place. It was just a quagmire of mud and water, and my initial impression was that we had lost everything. Though the conditions were far from ideal, nature showed surprising resilience. In side streams, some fish did manage to survive. We were able to go into some of those tributaries and found all sorts of little juvenile trout, steelhead, and salmon. And these are the fish that are going to be the seed source for continuing the run. So even though everything in the main stem was fried with the temperatures and the sediment that we got, we had a source of recovery there in the tributary stream. Before man was here, the river had eruptions and recovered and did quite nicely. And so if we're patient and don't try to interfere too much, I think the river will be back to what it was. The eruption on May 18th not only altered waterways, it created new ones. When the landslide came down the Tootle Valley, it blocked off side channels, creating Castle and Coldwater lakes. Coldwater is now open to visitors. To create a lake of that size is just amazing. To have something like that just kind of pop up overnight. The fishermen have been extremely excited. We're managing that for large fish with limited catch. Just a one fish limit. People just cannot believe they're catching fish of that size west of the mountain. The Department of Fish and Wildlife planted fish in Coldwater in 1989. This was possible because it only took the lakes a few years to clean themselves after the eruption. Even Spirit Lake, which was hardest hit, healed itself quickly. When the debris avalanche slid into this valley, it physically raised the lake's location by several hundred feet. The bottom of the lake now sits above the former surface. Part of the log mat still floats about the lake. At the time of the eruption, the abnormally high amount of organic material which was washed into the water made it the consistency of sewage sludge. All of the organic material, all of the leaves and the branches from the forest that were vaporized and shredded by the eruption, ended up being leached into the waters like tea from a tea bag. And that caused bacterial populations to explode. So the lakes were literally boiling with carbon dioxide and methane. In that state, the lakes were uninhabitable for marine life, but bacteria were able to clear the water within just 3 years of the eruption. There really wasn't a precedent for this kind of alteration of a lake environment, and essentially everything that happened was a surprise. And when you think about how fast bacteria reproduce and then the generations of them that cycle, you can imagine they would be able to process quite a bit of organic material. And obviously the wonderful rainfall we get in the Northwest, there was a lot of dilution of incoming rainfall and snow melt and a lot of stirring of oxygen into the lakes with wind and waves and things like that. So the physical process has helped out as well. The mountain and its surroundings were declared a national monument back in 1982, and having such a large section of land under exclusive federal control has proved to be advantageous during the most recent activity. One of the challenges with volcanoes is that they disturb large areas, especially with things like mud flows that can travel many miles from the volcano. It's certainly much easier when the area around the volcano is wholly inside of federal ownership, and we're able to establish things like the 5-mile radius circle around the volcano and really pull people back beyond that. So that makes it much easier to manage and also to see what's happening around the volcano. By studying in the monument, geologists can see how Mount St. Helens is connected to a history that dates back millions of years. What they learn here can help provide insight to the rest of the Cascade Range and to other volcanoes around the world. The most unique learning opportunities resulting from the events in 1980 had to do with the debris avalanche and blast. Pictures and eyewitness information provided by people like Gary Rosenquist and Dorothy Stoffel gave scientists a chance to understand a phenomenon they had never witnessed before. Because of the observations at Mount St. Helens of the event and then of the deposits that it produced, we've come to realize that events like that sector collapse with its large landslide have occurred many times at explosive volcanoes around the world. So it's a common event, but one that we were really never prepared to appreciate before. They are also able to watch closely as the volcano rebuilds itself. After the eruption on May 18th, the crater floor was relatively flat. In fact, there was kind of a dimple or depression where the vent was, beneath where the present dome is, and several times during the summer of 1980, a small incipient dome began to grow in that vent. But each time, a later and smaller explosive eruption than the one on May 18th destroyed the little dome, and the dome had to start over again. After that summer was over, then the dome began to be able to grow without being destroyed, and it grew in a series of about 17 dome-building episodes that occurred from late 1980 through October 1986, and then petered out. The dome stopped growing at that time. The 1980 dome is about 3,000 feet wide at the base and over 800 feet tall. It is the result of gas-depleted magma left over from the eruption on May 18th. The series of small eruptions that built this dome were spread out across more than half a decade. After that, Mount St. Helens fell silent. It was a silence she would keep for 18 years. Then, in October of 2004, the mountain cleared her throat and began to rebuild herself once more. Over a relatively short period of time, we accumulated a large number of magnitude 2 earthquakes, which was very uncommon for Mount St. Helens. About the 28th of September, we started seeing this area behind the old lava dome and the glacier rising and cracking. Obviously, something was moving up close to the surface and disturbing the ground. Not long after that, we detected the first traces of volcanic gas. And of course, on October 1st, we had the first explosion. Several more followed in the following days, and we quite rapidly went from sleepy Mount St. Helens to an eruption in progress. The new dome began to appear between the 1980 dome and the crater wall, dividing and pushing aside the glacier that had been growing in a horseshoe shape around the crater's edge since 1986. This is coming out at an angle, and so it's basically a reclined spine that just keeps pushing out, crumbling and then reforming and pushing out over its own debris. Unlike the 1980 dome that was built over a 6-year period in patches, one lobe piled on top of the next, this dome, called the whale's back, has breached the surface and formed in a more continuous fashion. Better than 40 million cubic meters so far in 6 months. That's half of the volume of the old lava dome in only 6 months instead of 6 years. That's quite remarkable in and of itself. But accompanying that extrusion, there haven't been the explosions. There have been small explosions like those in early October, but we haven't gotten any subplinian or plinian columns, the columns of ash that rise up that are driven by this rapid expansion of the gases coming out of solution in the magma. So that's telling us something fundamental about this magma, about its potential hazards into the future. And one of the things we're looking for very closely is any evidence of any more gas-rich magma. While the whale-back dome's development is exciting, geologists have already learned much by examining older formations exposed by the 1980 eruption. Much of what geologists see in the crater matches what they already believe to be the general sequence of events that had built the mountain. But the gaping crater gives them a nice cross-sectional view of the mountain's past. On the pumice plain created by the landslide and pyroclastic flows of 1980, scientists can see where young and old meet. Those rocks are part of a sequence of volcanic rocks that accumulated between about 38 and 24 million years ago in a long belt, extending from Mount Rainier in Washington state through southern Washington and the state of Oregon. The younger rocks which bank up against that cliff are all derived from Mount St. Helens. And near the base of the cliff, you can see some subtle pumice that remained from the debris avalanche of the morning of May 18, 1980. The horizontally layered rocks that you see in the little canyon wall are pyroclastic flow deposits from the summer of 1980. In the summer of 1980, this was a smooth surface, but erosion by streams draining from Mount St. Helens have cut deep canyons into the pyroclastic flow deposits. It's going to continue to change drastically over decades. There'll be continued erosion, but on the other hand, deposits in these washes will tend to fill up some of the low places too. So it will be evolving. As the mountain evolves, so does the technology scientists use to monitor it. All the mountains in the Cascade Range are monitored to some degree, but since Mount St. Helens is the most active, it receives extra attention. This is the first eruption that we've used this FLIR instrument, which is a forward-looking infrared. It's basically the same kind of camera police use to find warm bodies running at night. And the one we have, we can calibrate so we can actually tell spot temperatures. That was very useful early on when we started seeing that, in fact, there is hot material close to the surface. Collecting data is vital to understanding what might come next, but the crater of a volcano is a hazardous laboratory. We landed next to this mass and looked up at it. It was like looking up at an extremely steep slope. It was a striated slope. You could see how that surface had just been dragged out of the ground. It was scratched to make these grooves in it. That ends up being one of the most remarkable and interesting scientific things about this eruption, how that material was produced and how it was striated. The surface of the whale's back is covered with 1 to 2 meters of fault gouge. From a distance, it appears to be smooth white rock. But the rock itself is really not rock. It's just ground up as a powder. It falls apart in your hand. This is the kind of thing that happens along fault zones when masses of the Earth's plates rub against each other, and they grind each side apart into that kind of powder. That's what we're seeing at St. Helens. It's really unusual. This kind of thing, to our knowledge, hasn't been described in this thickness anywhere else on Earth. Though the information learned is vital, collecting data manually from an active volcano is usually not possible. That's why necessity is the mother of invention. In this case, the invention is being called a spider. We needed instruments close in. On several occasions, we've lost those through explosions. One of the scientists here developed basically portable instruments that could be slung in by helicopter. And as far as we know, this is the first eruption where these portable instruments have been used. So we've been able to sling in seismometers or GPS instruments or gas sensors very quickly by helicopter, set them down, and leave them. The 1980 eruption resulted in a quantum leap in geologists' understanding of how volcanoes work. However, there still is much to be learned. For example, by studying microscopic crystal formations and rock samples taken from the new dome, they hope to determine whether or not future eruptions will be violent. If a magma rises very rapidly from depth, the gas that's dissolved in it is going to come out of solution very rapidly. That's what drives explosions and explosive eruptions. If you're living on the flanks of a volcano, if you're downwind in an airplane, we've even had 747s come close to crashing by ingesting ash into the engines. So we need to know how much gas is in the magma. We need to know how likely it is to produce an explosive eruption. So we're getting all of that information by analyzing the crystal, by looking at the textures, how this material out here in what's called the ground mass, how it grew. All of the work we're doing here is oriented toward that understanding of how volcanoes work, because we have to have that underlying scientific foundation if we're going to be able to save lives and property in the end. The latest activity here at Mount St. Helens is only our most recent reminder that when the mountain goes quiet, even if it's for years, we have to remember she's only napping. The volcanic activity here will continue, and no matter how good we become at monitoring it, the mountain and the mountain alone will dictate what comes next. The blast ended in seconds, but its echo rewrote time. It rewrote the landscape, the rivers, the forests. It rewrote the lives of everyone who was there. It rewrote the way we understand volcanoes, and it left behind a legacy, not just of destruction, but of resilience, of survival, of life finding a way back, even in the most hostile conditions. If this story moved you, if it made you understand the power of nature and the fragility of human life, then stay with us, subscribe, and keep its echo alive. Because stories like this matter. They remind us that the earth is not ours to control. It's ours to respect, and sometimes, when we forget, the mountain reminds us. The eruption of Mount St. Helens on May 18, 1980, killed 57 people, but it also saved thousands more through the lessons it taught, through the data it provided, through the warning systems it inspired, and through the memories it left behind. Those who survived carry those memories with them every day. Venus Durgan and Roald Rayton, who nearly drowned in the mud flow. Mike and Lou Moore, who carried their infant daughters through the ash. Kathy Anderson, who made a decision she couldn't explain that saved her entire crew. Jess Hagerman, who risked his life to pull survivors from the gray wasteland. Dorothy Stoffel, who flew over the mountain just seconds before it exploded. Gary Rosenquist, who captured the eruption in 23 photographs. They all carry the mountain with them, and the mountain carries them. Because that's what happens when you survive something like this. You become part of it, part of its story, part of its echo, and that echo will continue to reverberate for as long as the mountain stands, for as long as the forests grow, for as long as the rivers run, for as long as we remember.